Hi. Hello. Welcome. My name is Heather. This is Miss Finn. And this is the very first episode of Nice People, where we talk about the kinds of things nice people don't talk about. Today's topic is a big one. It directly pertains to you, and yet you've probably never heard of it before. What if I told you that quite possibly the single greatest predictor of your health, wealth, and overall quality of life in adulthood is your childhood? Or that for over 20 years, studies have consistently shown that everything from chronic disease to high-risk behaviors, substance use, crime, homelessness, and so much more are all the predictable and therefore preventable outcomes of childhood trauma and adversity. No clue what I'm talking about? Well, that's okay, because today I'm going to tell you all about the most important study you've never heard of, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. We're going to go over the study itself, what adverse childhood experiences are, the shocking things the study found, and how we might use those findings to solve a number of the seemingly insurmountable crises we face today. Sound good? Great. The study is about childhood trauma, so there will be mentions of or references to childhood physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, mental illness, chronic disease, substance use, and, I have to censor it for YouTube, unaliving oneself. If you can handle just hearing those words, you should be fine with this episode. However, if these kinds of subjects aren't really where you want to go mentally right now, then maybe consider skipping this one. I'll give you a minute. Okay, let's get into it. In 1985, Dr. Vincent Felitti accidentally discovered that hundreds of people in the obesity clinic he was running had been sexually abused as children. Now, this discovery was important for two reasons. Number one, having hundreds of victims within a single clinic completely went against Dr. Felitti's belief that childhood sexual abuse is rare. Sadly, it isn't. But more importantly, was that it suggested that childhood trauma might affect our health in adulthood. Totally radical idea at the time, but his data was very compelling. When Dr. Felitti presented his findings at an obesity conference, he was expecting the other physicians in attendance to be just as amazed and intrigued as he was. Yeah, that didn't happen.
I was attacked by the audience. Some guy gets up and under the guise of asking a question, he makes the pronouncement that these statements by patients are basically fabrications to provide a cover explanation for failed lives.
Yikes.
Go get fucked, bud.
And when Dr. Felitti suggested that they might want to screen their own patients for childhood trauma, he was met with another wave of vitriol, with them claiming,
"We can't ask our patients things like that. It's offensive."
Clearly, we've got a problem here. At dinner that night, Dr. Felitti was sitting next to an epidemiologist from the CDC who recognized the potential significance these findings had for the practice of medicine. He told Dr. Felitti that he was going to need a study, one that sampled thousands of people from the general population before anyone took these findings seriously. Luckily, Dr. Felitti had access to an entire department where tens of thousands of people came in every year for medical exams. And he thought, what if we screened them for adverse childhood experiences when they come in for appointments? Well, that's exactly what they did. Dr. Felitti, along with Dr. Robert Onda from the CDC, began the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE study, to examine if and how adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, affect our health and well-being in adulthood. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood, so before the age of 18, as well as aspects of the child's environment that undermines their sense of safety, stability, and bonding. So things like witnessing domestic violence, growing up in poverty, living with a parent who struggles with substance dependence. Those things would be considered ACEs too. The study screened over 17,000 middle-aged Americans for their history of exposure to 10 categories of ACEs. The categories chosen were based on their prevalence from the obesity clinic and included things like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, household substance abuse, household mental illness, incarcerated household members, and parental separation or divorce. For each type of ACE they had, they got 1 point toward their overall ACE score. Researchers then took all of these ACE scores and correlated them with the health statuses of the participants. And, oh boy, did they make some shocking discoveries. First, let's go over the main findings from the study, and then we'll explore some of the finer details. Main finding number 1. ACEs are common. Roughly 2/3 of the participants had at least one ACE, and 1 in 8 had 4 or more. Remember that number 4, because it's important. Main finding number 2. There's a dose-response relationship between ACE scores and health outcomes, meaning the higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. Main finding number 3. ACEs dramatically increase your risk of developing chronic diseases, adopting high-risk behaviors, and experiencing major social malfunction like incarceration and homelessness. Main finding number 4. ACEs significantly increase your risk of at least 7 out of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. Oh, that's right. That stuff that happened to you in childhood might end up killing you. Let's look at some of the causes of death, shall we? Keeping it light.
Heart disease.
The number 1 killer in the US and worldwide. Just to put things in perspective, having high cholesterol increases your risk of heart disease by about 39%. That's a lot, hence why, if you have access to health care, your doctor monitors your cholesterol and helps you manage it and lower your risk of heart disease, right? Routine screening and treatment. Well, having an ACE score of 4, any 4 of the 10, doesn't matter which ones, increases your risk of heart disease by 200%. 200%. Now, I'm willing to bet you've never had a doctor screen you for ACEs, but they really should be, considering that for cancer, same deal, 200%. For stroke, it's 250%. COPD is 300%. Alzheimer's is 420%. And diabetes, 150%. Now, as if those numbers weren't shocking or tragic enough, they found that an ACE score of 4 increases your risk of depression by 400% and attempting to take your own life by 1,200%. Really seems like we should be screening for these. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but these numbers only go up with each additional point in your ACE score. So much so, in fact, that an ACE score of 6, so just 2 more points in your ACE score, your risk of attempting to take your own life jumps to 4,600%, and you have a shortened life expectancy by 20 years. So right about now, you're probably wondering, if this is true, why haven't I heard of this before, and why aren't doctors screening for ACEs? Both great questions. Don't worry, I won't leave you totally hanging. The answers aren't exactly simple, but I can point to 2 big reasons why. Number 1, doctors today are not trained in routine screening and treatment of ACEs. Although slowly that is changing, but nowhere near fast enough. Oh, it's okay. It's just rain. Oh. The second reason, and likely the reason why you haven't heard of this before, is because of how uncomfortable we are talking about or asking about childhood trauma. Right? Think back to all of the resistance Dr. Felitti got from doctors.
These people lie. We can't ask them these things. It's offensive.
Neither of those are true, by the way. And it's not just Dr. Felitti either. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris also talks about her experience of people just not wanting to talk about it and wondering why we're not taking this more seriously.
You know, at first,
I thought that we marginalize the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick.
Ooh, I mean, when you're right, you're right. I mean, where's the lie? Now, when I first learned all of this, I panicked and tried to come up with any reason why this doesn't apply to me. I thought, okay, hang on. It only makes sense that if you do things like drink or smoke or do drugs, that you're more likely to develop chronic diseases or die early. And I don't do those things, so I must be fine. Makes sense, right? Too bad that isn't the case. Get this. Even if you don't engage in any high-risk behaviors, you are still more likely to develop these outcomes. I know, right? How is that possible? When it comes to how and why ACEs are so damaging, it turns out that it has nothing to do with the ACEs themselves. There aren't some that are more or less damaging than others, and there are a lot more than the 10 categories used in the study. The real culprits are our stress response, toxic stress, and how it affects the developing bodies and brains of children.
How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging.
ACEs activate the stress response in children. And when they're activated, they need support from a caring adult to help them feel safe again so they can shut down their stress response. But when a child doesn't have that support, maybe their parent is the bear or is too distracted by substance use or mental illness, and their stress response just keeps getting activated over and over and over again, that chronic or prolonged activation of the stress response is called toxic stress. And toxic stress has some pretty detrimental immediate and long-term effects on the developing bodies and brains of children. When a child is chronically activated, it tells their developing body and brain that their environment is such to where they need to always be ready to fight or flee from the bear, and eventually they will lose the ability to shut down their stress response in a normal, healthy way. Toxic stress also alters brain structure and function. It affects their immune system, hormonal systems, and even down to the way their DNA is read and transcribed. I can't get into epigenetics in this video, but yeah, ACEs can literally get into our DNA and can be passed on to our children. And for the kids who are experiencing toxic stress, the signs or symptoms, if any, are often misdiagnosed, misunderstood, or missed entirely. So think of the brain as having two distinct parts, survival brain and learning brain. Our survival brain is 100% devoted to keeping us alive by doing things like detecting threats and activating our stress response when a threat is detected. Our learning brain is what we use for things like learning, memory, judgment, decision-making, and impulse control. When our stress response is activated, the survival part of our brain gets turned way up, and the thinking or learning part of our brain gets turned way down, because in a life or death situation, it is not advantageous to be weighing your options or considering whether or not it's practical to fight or run from a bear. Don't think, just act. Well, for the kids who are chronically activated and therefore stuck in survival brain mode, they can't just magically overwrite it to be in learning brain mode just because they're, say, in a classroom. These kids experiencing toxic stress may appear to have shorter attention spans, difficulty concentrating, an inability to sit still in class, poor impulse control, maybe even acting out. Is any of that sounding familiar? Exactly. ADHD. When Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris began her practice in one of San Francisco's poorest, most underserved communities, she kept getting kids referred to her by parents and teachers and principals who believed that they had ADHD. But when she did a thorough history and assessment of these kids, she couldn't diagnose most of them with ADHD, even though they had the symptoms. This is because a key part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD is that the symptoms can't be the result of some other mental health condition. Now, she didn't know whether or not these kids had some kind of mental health condition. However, she did know from her assessments of them that they all had histories of trauma and neglect. She knew that even though these kids didn't have ADHD, something was going on with them. And when she looked into the science and studies like the ACE study, it suddenly all made sense. These kids didn't have ADHD. They're chronically activated, and that's why they can't sit still or pay attention in class. None of this is to say that ADHD isn't real. It absolutely is. Or that kids with ACEs can't also have ADHD. They absolutely can. The point is that there is a lot of overlap between ADHD symptoms and what we might call toxic stress or ACEs symptoms. But doctors today are not trained in routine screening and treatment of ACEs. And again, they really should be, because when Dr. Burke-Harris made screening for ACEs part of her practice,
Unfortunately, what we found was very similar to what Kaiser and the CDC had found in their study. The big difference between our study and their study, they asked adults, which of these happened to you before you were age 18? And in our study, our average age was 8 years old. But what we found was that for our patients who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, they were twice as likely to be overweight or obese, and 32 times as likely to have learning and behavior problems in school.
so the ACE study focused on outcomes in adulthood, so we can't really look to that for indicators of how ACEs affect kids. However, we do know that traumatized kids are more likely to have behavior and learning difficulties, to have mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and suicidality, to use drugs, alcohol, and tobacco, end up in the juvenile justice system, have unintended pregnancies or paternity, have problems with absenteeism, tardiness, suspension, and expulsion, and to fail or drop out of school. And through this lens, we can begin to see exactly how ACEs go on to affect them for the rest of their lives. One effect of major chronic unrelieved stress, or toxic stress, is suppression of the immune system. This is why there's a higher prevalence of autoimmune and other chronic diseases amongst people with ACEs. It's also the reason why people with ACEs are at a higher risk of developing these things, even if they don't engage in any high-risk behavior. ACEs alter brain structure and function. ACEs alter brain structure and function, meaning there are very real neurological reasons why people with ACEs may go on to engage in high-risk behaviors. We already went over how being stuck in survival brain mode means you have diminished access to your thinking brain, the part you need for judgment, decision making, and impulse control. But ACEs also alter the pleasure and reward part of the brain, making it much harder for people with ACEs to feel those things naturally. So not only are you more prone to poor decision making and impulsive actions, but you're more likely to turn to substances for relief from the enduring effects of toxic stress and untreated trauma. We are currently in the midst of an opioid and methamphetamine epidemic. Now remember, people with ACEs have alterations to their brain that make it much harder for them to feel good or just have a sense of well-being. Opioids trigger a massive release of endorphins, filling you with a sense of well-being and relieving physical pain.
Most of the opiate addicts, heroin addicts that I worked with, they're just trying to get through the day. A common path is someone will have some sort of trauma growing up, and they have emotional regulation that is difficult for them. It's hard for them to get through the day without having significant amounts of pain and anxiety and anger and just unbridled emotion. They go to a physician and they are prescribed an opiate. And for the very first time, they feel okay. For the very first time in their life, they no longer feel that constant nagging pain and anxiety that they have felt ever since they could remember. And they're like, wait, what? Is this what everyone else is feeling? Because it looks like everyone else is fine, and I feel like I feel that way now. They can relax and they can get work done, they can get through the day, they just feel normal. And that's what often this is like with opiate addiction.
What was next? Oh, methamphetamine. Methamphetamine. In 1940, methamphetamine became the leading, FDA-approved, prescription antidepressant in the United States, and it stayed number one for like 18 years. It was so popular because it induced feelings of euphoria and a sense of well-being. Starting to see a pattern here? Back then, regular everyday Americans were using it. Kennedy was using it. I know I'm kind of laughing, but it's not funny. It's really sad. The people using these substances aren't doing it because they want to ruin their health or ruin their lives. They just want to feel okay. The way they should and probably would have felt if their childhoods hadn't locked them into survival mode and set them up for a lifetime of negative consequences. Speaking of that lifetime of negative consequences, just like the health outcomes, the same dose-response relationship exists between ACEs and over 40 different outcomes, including mental illness, substance dependence, housing instability, including homelessness, involvement with gangs, crime, and the criminal justice system, domestic and intimate partner violence, re-victimization, reduced educational achievement, decreased work productivity and performance, unemployment, poverty, and disability, just to name a few. These are some of the biggest challenges we face as a society today, and yet I never hear any acknowledgement that ACEs might be the root of these problems. Do you? How can we take what we know from the ACE study and incorporate that into solutions for these seemingly insurmountable problems?
So the World Health Organization weighed in on this, and they said, viewed through the public health lens, adverse childhood experiences are widely prevalent, highly interrelated, and intergenerational. Many conditions that public health seeks to prevent as if they were a primary problem are actually seen to be the diverse outcomes or symptoms of a common set of underlying determinants. Consequently, ACEs themselves are the primary problem, and for a truly preventive upstream approach, public health and social development policies and programs need to be explicitly aimed at ACE reduction.
While ACE reduction is an important goal, and there are a number of programs and policies we can adopt to achieve that goal, we'll likely never be able to eliminate all the sources of ACEs in kids' lives. But here's some good news. We don't have to. Remember, The ACEs themselves are not what's causing all of the damage. It's the toxic stress that can happen as a result. So by focusing on reducing and preventing toxic stress, we are reducing and preventing the long-term consequences of ACEs. I'm sure we can all think of examples of people with ACEs, even high ACE scores, who went on to live great lives, or at least didn't end up with the negative medical, social, and economic consequences of their ACEs. So how does that happen? Obviously, I can't answer for everyone, but I do have one answer. A recent study found that just like how ACEs predict negative outcomes, positive childhood experiences, ones that develop a child's sense of belonging and connection, can predict positive outcomes, including good health in childhood and adulthood, and success in school. In fact, they found that even if a kid has ACEs, positive childhood experiences can buffer toxic stress and therefore protect them from the lifelong consequences of ACEs. That's incredible. Feeling safe and protected by an adult at home, feeling supported by their family in difficult times, being able to talk to their family about how they're feeling supported by their friends, feeling a sense of belonging in school, enjoying and participating in community traditions, and having at least 2 non-parent adults who genuinely care about them. The commonalities I see are safety, support, connection, belonging. All antidotes or buffers to toxic stress. That's why the best way we can combat ACEs and all of their negative outcomes is with policies and programs that strengthen and stabilize families so that their parents and caregivers can be that critical buffer to toxic stress. The root cause and contributing factors to so many ACEs boil down to poverty, a lack of resources, and a lack of support for parents and caregivers, who are very likely suffering the consequences of their own ACEs, by the way. Some of the key prevention strategies that the CDC has identified include providing sufficient financial support, access to affordable, high-quality childcare and preschool, connecting kids with after-school programs and mentorship programs, and providing access to doctors and mental health care and substance dependence treatment. All of these things will go a long way towards reducing and preventing ACEs and toxic stress. As a hypothetical example, let's say there's a girl who grew up in poverty, witnessing domestic violence, whose father is an alcoholic and whose mother suffers with depression and anxiety, and for all these reasons, they are just not able to be that critical buffer to toxic stress for her. This girl starts to struggle in school, starts using alcohol to cope with her depression and anxiety, maybe ends up with her first boyfriend, and ends up pregnant at 17. All very likely outcomes for someone with her ACE score. Now, she's a single mother with, at best, a high school education, so she works multiple jobs but still really struggles financially. She has depression and anxiety and self-medicates with alcohol. Her intimate relationships mirror the ones modeled to her, so now her kid is growing up witnessing domestic violence, growing up in poverty, and living with a parent who suffers with substance dependence and mental illness. And the cycle just continues. Now imagine that same girl, still a single mother, still struggling with mental illness and substance dependence, but thanks to ACE prevention policies and programs available to her, she's able to get treatment for her substance dependence and mental illness, go to therapy to heal from her trauma and improve her self-worth, and break the cycle of abuse by learning to have happy and healthy relationships. She has sufficient financial support, so she doesn't have to struggle or fail to provide a safe, stable home for her and her child with everything they need to be happy and healthy. While she's at work, her child is being well taken care of, and when she's at home, she's able to spend time bonding with her child and making them feel safe and supported and loved by her. In this reality, instead of her child having 4 ACEs, they maybe have 1 or none. Or maybe it doesn't matter how many ACEs they have because thanks to these ACE policies and programs, they were able to have positive childhood experiences and buffer the toxic stress. And their risk of ending up just like their mother or with the negative outcomes of ACEs is significantly reduced, instead of increased. I like to try and imagine what this country and the world would look like if we all just had what we needed from the beginning and didn't have to suffer from the totally preventable lifelong consequences of ACEs. Wouldn't that be nice? Our biggest obstacles right now are the lack of awareness about ACEs and their outcomes, but also our collective inability to talk about them. Dr. Felitti once described ACEs as experiences that are overwhelmingly unrecognized. They're kept as family secrets. We're all taught as children that nice people don't talk about certain things. They're lost in time, and then further protected by shame and by secrecy and by social taboos against exploring certain realms of human experience. The reality is that the majority of us have at least one ACE, and even though ACEs affect all of us, either directly or indirectly, we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. The most impactful thing we can do right now is talk about ACEs. Destigmatize these subjects and experiences. Be the nice people who talk about these things and make it easier for others to do so. If you would like to join me in being one of the nice people who talk about these things, consider subscribing. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I'm eager to know what you think. What do you think about ACEs and the ACE study? Had you heard of it before? Does any of this resonate with you and your lived experience? Did you hate this video and hate me and want to tell me all about it in the comments? Go ahead. And whether you liked it, loved it, or hated it, I hope to see you again soon. Bye. Say goodbye, Finn.
All it's supposed to feel